They got to go to the invitation.
Right, they have to go to Zoom, click on the Zoom, link, and then open up Zoom, yes.
Okay. I don't know if all of them have the link, but I know that I have it now. I think I'm one of them that have the link. Do you need to go back and read the link to them, or do you want me to?
Just go to zoom.com, or you can send in the link. You can just go to zoom.com and just join the presentation.
We have a microphone here. They said that they can just come to the microphone.
That's fine, they can actually see the presentation from where they are.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we want to do it.
Everybody can see it.
All right, so let's just get started, so I'll just close the chat box. Okay, all right, thank you. So, sorry you all for the, my name is Reverend Miller. I'm the Data Research Operations Director here at Mount Sinai. I'm a Tuskegee graduate, 1986 class. Today we're going to talk about facility design and construction. The important thing about facility design and construction is that it's not just a research topic. There are topics pertinent to facility design that are pertinent to private practice, and we're going to talk about some of those now. I'm going to pause for just a moment and just ensure everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah.
I can't hear you. Can someone post the mic to say yes or no?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And so the significant facility design principles are applicable to veterinary medicine in a number of settings. So the research laboratory setting, if you call vivarium, a private practice setting, which some of you may be interested in, veterinary teaching hospitals, and zoo and wildlife and conservation facilities also have various design criteria that are specific to their environment. There's a document called the Guide to the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. And two of the 5 chapters of the guide are devoted to facilities design and operation, and specifically environment, housing, and management of animals. Research animals are covered in that document, as well as physical plan. To stop and say that the reason, from a veterinary perspective, that this would be something that you should be interested in is that while you're going to have facility managers and architects and engineers associated with maintaining the facility, you as the veterinarian will be responsible for the expertise associated with the care of the animals housed in the vivarium. So while there are engineering criteria that others will be more familiar with, you'll be familiar with the biology and needs of the animal. And so as a team, you're responsible for ensuring the environment for those animals is adequate. I think the research environment is particularly significant and different than most environments you'd be encountering, in that animals live there for the entirety of their life, which is why we call it vivarium. It's a living environment, as opposed to, say, a private practice environment where it's a transient occupation space for animals. So the criteria of designing that facility more specifically covers longer duration of animals within that space. There are various accrediting bodies that really that we're responsible for. These are not bodies that do inspections like USDA or state that you may be familiar with. These bodies are not required, but to have accreditation is considered to be a gold standard. So the accrediting body in research in the laboratory animal environment is called AAA or ALAC, and that's associated with the assessment and accreditation of laboratory animal care. It's an international organization. A corollary to that in private practice would be AHA, the American Animal Hospital Accreditation. Again, not required, not mandatory accreditation, but it is an indication of the gold standard and the higher standard In fact, from a research perspective, even though ALAC accreditation is not required, those facilities that are accredited tend to be looked upon more favorably when it comes to funding and those types of things. So it carries the same impact as regulation. Both of these accrediting agencies have organizations, have minimum construction standards and core principles. And we'll talk about some of those, and we'll start with looking at the AHA and then bring in ALAC. If you look at some of the general operational areas of a private practice setting, so you have operating rooms, you have anesthesia standards for evaporation of waste gases, is an example of that. How your client services should be constructed, how you handle contagious disease within your private practice. Then there are certain requirements for dentistry and diagnostic imaging, construction of rooms, especially if you're looking at radiography, examination facilities, laboratories, where's your pharmacy located within your practice, and then housekeeping and maintenance. All of these types of standards help you design your physical plan so that it provides ultimate functionality. I would stop and add that all of these same types of requirements apply to a veterinary teaching hospital. So as you are becoming more familiar with these standards, when you walk into an environment, you should immediately start to assess that environment to determine whether it's meeting these standards, and not just walk into the environment, just focus on the animal itself, with the patient interaction. Let's look specifically at contagious disease standards. It's stated the practice must utilize a single-purpose isolation room where activities are restricted to providing care for contagious patients. So when you're designing your hospital, you need to think about a space within that practice where you can isolate animals that appear to be affected with contagious disease. Quarantine and isolation is a common practice of incoming animals in a laboratory animal environment. And we practice veterinary medicine from a colony health perspective in laboratory animal medicine. We aren't as focused on the individual animal as you would be in private practice. So when you're bringing animals into a colony, you want to have in place quarantine and isolation procedures to ensure the health of those animals before introducing them to an established colony. Because at the end of the day, it's all about preventive medicine we'll talk about. Within a quarantine environment, again, you're going to have designated rooms, facilities, and the physical design of those spaces will enhance the containment, as well as the practices and procedures for containment, such as PPE, personal protective equipment. So the type of PPE that you use and how you handle PPE is a critical component to your isolation, maintaining isolation and protection of your facility. You should also think and design a facility where you're going to discard used PPE. That's another critical component. Going back to AHA standards, isolation rooms maintain negative air pressure. So air pressurization is an important component to control disease transmission. And we'll come back to that over and over. We start talking about HVAC. But your air pressure is something you need to be aware of. If you have a contagious airborne pathogen in a positively pressurized space, obviously you don't have containment. So that becomes an issue that will compromise your facility. Likewise, from a diagnostic imaging perspective, you want to have adequate shielding. You want to consider the shielding capabilities and shielding requirements for a room. It frankly goes into the construction cost of that space as well. And then housekeeping and maintenance. We have dryers and cleaning chemicals adjacent to animal housing areas. How are you going to maintain those animals and protect them and make sure they're safe from those odors? So AHA has some some mandatory standards. Remember I said, for the most part, these accreditation bodies are voluntary organizations, but within each of those accredited bodies, there are some mandatory standards where, your accreditation would be compromised. There are suggestions for improvement through the accreditation process, and there are mandatory items. And so within AHA, some of the mandatory items of patient care, caging, the type of caging, safety of caging, how your surgery area is designed to maintain an aseptic environment, and how your pharmacy is constructed to ensure that your controlled substances are adequately safeguarded. So just here's an extension of the mandatory items for AHA. So in the area of patient caging, for instance, so it should be secure, escape-proof, in good condition, and they don't specify what good condition means. Some of these is common sense standard. Easy to clean, we'll talk about what easy to clean means when you get into the lab animal environment. And adequate for the senses. So that just means you should have adequate cages so that you don't encounter an overcrowding situation. Similar to a surgery environment, you want to have a designated pre-surgical, that's a prep area, surgical area, recovery areas. When we get to laboratory animal environments, this requirement for a pre-surgical space is very significant. So in lab animal, we break things down into large and small animals. In the large animal facility, so anything larger than the guinea pig in a laboratory animal setting is considered to be a large animal. And that really tracks more around USDA requirements as opposed to actually size of the animal. But when you have large animals in a vivarium setting, one of the criteria for a surgery space is you must have a designated prep area that is separate from your surgery space. So when you're inspected by USDA or other bodies, they look specifically at how that is set up and designed. And these other areas here are similar to a lab animal setting, non-porous, table material, how your oxygen is provided, again, scavenging of waste gases comes up for protection of the human occupants in the space, as well as animals. So the ventilation requirements for AHA are similar, the same as research in scavenging of waste gases, maintenance of proper temperatures. I would add temperature and humidity is an important criteria for a lab animal setting. Private practice settings don't really focus much on humidity, but it is something that you should be aware of. It's a critical component to maintaining adequate temperature. And airflow to minimize odors. Minimization of odors is really more issue around the comfort of the human occupants. If you look at ammonia levels within an environment, humans tend to be much more sensitive to these. But it is something you need to consider if you're housing animals. So we have a large rodent population as an example. We have 200 or 300 cages of rodent, mice cages. The ammonia levels can become high very quickly. And so your ability to minimize those odors is something you need to consider. The odors within a room could also be a factor in breeding. So if you have rodents in a room and they're able to smell pheromones, the pheromones can affect the breeding, the cycling of the females and the behavior of the males. So all of those issues are controlled by adequate ventilation. This is just another example of the overlap between the research and the private practice environment, where there's some shared standards such as ventilation, lighting levels are a critical factor, particularly in the lab animal environment, where you have a breeding colony. The lighting in a private practice environment is probably more of a task lighting condition. So you want to have adequate lighting to perform tasks, and not so much of an impact on the behavior of animals that you can see in the lab animal environment. Traffic flow, very important. Facility design is one thing, but how you move within that facility, how the flow of traffic, the flow of materials, the flow of clean and dirty materials is an important component of facility design. It must be thought of as you're laying out the facility. We'll come back to that at some point. How you sanitize the facility, or the ability to sanitize the facility can be directly impacted by the materials that are used in your construction. You have a number of, so wood is a good example. Often individuals would like to place wood within the facility because of the aesthetic appeal to wood. But if wood is not sealed and porous, it becomes affected for disease. So those types of things you need to think about when you're designing your facility. And then your housing criteria. I'm kind of going through this relatively quickly. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me, or if you have some comments, please chime in. So let's talk about some concepts, some basic concepts of facility design. So as I said, in the laboratory animal environment, disease prevention and containment is a primary form of design facility. In the laboratory animal environment, because everything hinges upon preventive medicine as our particular approach, if you find yourself in a situation where you're constantly treating disease in the laboratory animal environment, there's some failure. And that's somewhat different than you might expect to encounter in a private practice setting. Again, traffic patterns. In general, you tend to work from clean to dirty. The exception of that would be in a cage wash facility, which we'll talk about. If you work from clean to dirty, that tends to prevent, again, the transmission of disease. And that goes back to this concept of traffic flow. You want your traffic flow to flow from clean to dirty as you move supplies around your facility. And the facility must be laid out in such a manner to accommodate that traffic flow. And then fomites. Fomites are those things that, those inanimate objects that can bring disease into the facility. It can range from food and bedding. The way that food and bedding is stored at your vendor's site could be a source of fomites, especially if vermin have access to that food. The use of wooden pallets can bring roaches and other vermin into the facility. So those types of fomites you want to be aware of. We had a situation many years ago in the laboratory environment I was responsible for. We had an outbreak of mouse hepatitis virus, and we could not figure out how MHD was transmitted from between these two facilities. Even though we had MHD on campus, we had strict traffic patterns. And after over several weeks of questioning and evaluation, we determined that one of the researchers was checking plugs. And so you check to determine whether a mouse or a rat is pregnant. It's a copulatory plug that you can look for. And in checking those plugs, this technician was using a set of tongs that she was taking between facilities. So everything else she was cognizant about and was paying strict attention to traffic patterns, but these tongs were the ones that she used between both facilities, and that was the source of the fomite transmission. So as I've said, health status is viewed on a colony rather than individual basis. So the herd health concept dictates how a facility is designed, managed, and maintained. And that ranges anywhere from mice all the way up to primates. We're always thinking about colony health. Now obviously you have large animals like primates, sheep, pigs, dogs, and cats. Then obviously you end up doing more around individual health. But you're still looking at those animals and how they impact the overall colony. So preventive medicine becomes the mainstay. Let's talk about some terminology that is specific to the laboratory animal environment that comes into play when you're talking about the different types of facilities. So one term that you'll hear is called a conventional facility. And conventional facilities are facilities in which no special procedures other than initial health screening at the source and standard operation procedures are done. So an example of a conventional facility would be really a typical private practice environment or a veterinary teaching hospital, to be honest with you. You're aware, you take measures to evaluate the health of the animals that may be coming into your facility, but you really aren't doing anything to prevent transmission of disease within the area, anything extraordinary. So that's what a conventional facility is. You compare that to something we call barrier facilities. So a barrier facilities, those are facilities that are managed by practices designed to isolate or prevent infectious disease. So a typical type of a barrier environment would require that prior to entry, you would change clothes into designated clothing. You may shower in or shower out. That's what you call a full barrier. From a practical perspective, most research environments cannot function as full barriers. When you hear the concept full barriers, it typically applies to a breeding facility that's run commercially, like a Charles River or a Jackson Labs. But because of the number of people that go into a traditional research environment, you have researchers, you have public technicians, you have folks who are delivering supplies. It's really not practical to have a full barrier environment in most research settings. So most of us have what we call semi-barriers. They're managed the same types of procedures as a full barrier, except you typically don't have a shower in, shower requirement. You may have a requirement to change into scrubs when you enter the facility. Personnel who work in the facility, healthcare technicians, definitely have to change out. But often PIs, investigators, are allowed to come into the facility by donning special gowns that we provide within the facility. And when we say barrier, it's important to note that we are typically talking about a barrier between the outside world and the animals that are housed within the facility. So we are trying to protect the animals from the people who are entering the facility. That's the barrier that we're talking about. Do I hear a question there?
No.
Okay. So this concept of barrier, semi-barrier is really important. And before I go into containment, so when you talk about the types of animals that are housed in the facility, which also impinges upon this whole concept of barrier, one of the terms you will hear is pathogen-free or specific pathogen-free, SPF. So when we say pathogen-free animals, these are animals that are free of adventitious agents that could cause outbreak in the facility. Most of these agents are subclinical by nature, and so when you have an SPF facility, which is maintained by implementing these semi-barrier procedures, you also must ensure that the animal's health status is compatible with the colony. So then you do a screening of those animals that are entering the facility, where you also have sources that are trusted sources, such that you only house animals within a comparable environment. So you have SPF animals housed with SPF animals. You would never house animals that come from a conventional source in a barrier environment, because the health status of those animals is incompatible with that facility. So that facility design goes hand in hand with the vivarium practices to maintain the health of those animals. And that all constantly subsequently impacts the research. All this is about what you must do to maintain animals such that research is not compromised. You can imagine if you were studying respiratory disease and you had animals that had undetected respiratory illness, that would be a research variable, an unknown variable that would adversely affect that research. So in order for you to do credible research, you must maintain animals like under certain standards, and your facility design is a critical component of being able to accomplish those goals. Other terminology you should be aware of, we talked about this a little bit earlier, containment or isolation facilities, but now we're going into a different level of containment and isolation. In the private practice setting, we were talking about a room where your animals enter your environment and they may be suspected of having contagious disease, and so you need to isolate those animals. When we talk about containment or isolation facilities from a research perspective, we are talking about facilities that are designed to prevent escape of pathogens or restricted agents to a given location or area in the building. The classic definition of those is biosafety levels, and those facilities range from biosafety level 1 to biosafety level 4. A biosafety level 1 facility is a typical, it can be like a typical barbarian or a typical private practice, where there are no agents that are going to be overly infectious. It's just routine things that are just there. But they do have some ability to cause some subclinical disease, but it's not life-threatening. A biosafety level 4 facility, by contrast, is a facility that's built to contain highly pathogenic agents. The classic example is Ebola. So you can only do research or house Ebola-infected animals in a BSL-4 environment because the agent is deadly. There's no known vaccines to treat the agent, so you must have the strictest and highest standard for containment of those agents. Some of the containment is also associated with the transmissibility of the agent. So HIV is an example. So although HIV is a deadly agent, HIV is a BSL-2 agent because HIV is transmitted by bloodborne. It's not an aerosol transmitted agent. And housing in the BSL-4 environment just wouldn't be necessary. So it's not just the pathogenicity of an agent, it's also transmissibility that you must consider when you're looking at the containment criteria for a facility. BSL-3 facilities or ABSL-3, now the A there means animal. It's important to note that within a biosafety environment, if you're working with tissue culture, there's 1 degree of risk. As soon as you inject animals into that environment, you interject the ability to be bitten or scratched, urine, feces, all of those things that add to the risk in that environment that must be considered. And so animal biosafety level practices at a given BSL level, so a BSL-2 facility would be handled one way. An ABSL-3 facility would be handled a little notch higher because of the concern those animals present when they're infected with those agents. And that risk is obviously the risk to the personnel. So with the biosafety facility, airflow is key. The ability to control directional airflow is the lifeblood of a containment facility, supplemented by operational procedures, strict SOPs to maintain the integrity of those spaces. Other terminology you want to be aware of when you talk about a facility is the type of containment. So there's primary and secondary. So the primary containment is the cage or direct housing of animals. Compared to secondary containment, that's a larger space or room that contains the primary housing. So as an example, if you have mice housed in a room, the cage is a primary containment, the room is a secondary containment. So the concept is a box within a box. When you're talking about the types of containment. That's the easiest way to remember it. The smaller the box, the more primary it is, the larger the box, the more secondary. When you're housing large animals, because large animals, again, pigs, sheep, dogs, primates, because they are housed within a room typically, in that scenario, the room becomes the primary containment. These principles are all significant when you're thinking about the potential for disease transmission, and again, they become critical when you're looking at facility layout and how those spaces interact. Similar terms, but a little bit different, are microenvironment and macroenvironment. So again, we talk about secondary containment. Another way of looking at secondary containment could be the macroenvironment. If you think about micro and macroenvironment, really along the lines of temperature control. So the ability to control an animal's temperature and to maintain it in a thermal neutral zone is affected by the macro and microenvironment. So again, a cage would be the immediate housing area for that animal would be the microenvironment. These concepts are primarily applied to rodents, or any small animal, rodents, birds, not so much applied to housing large animals. So macro and microenvironmental concept. We strive to maintain a thermal neutral zone. And a thermal neutral zone is, just from a practical perspective, a number of definitions around thermal neutral zone. The temperature at which an animal does not expend any energy or behavioral change to maintain homeostasis, that state of comfort. So what you're trying to achieve when you design a facility. It's a continuum. It's difficult to maintain thermal neutrality, but you're always trying to do so. One thing you don't want is animals housed in an environment where they're experiencing extremes in temperature, cold stress, or heat stress. Not only is that detrimental to the animal's well-being, it's also adverse to any experiments that you may be doing. So you want to strive for that thermal neutrality to prevent those unintended influence on the research environment. So airflow is important to maintain the health status, control of odors, and temperature control. And directional airflow addresses how air is moving within and between spaces. We talk about airflow on a relative basis. So when you talk about airflow, you always say this room is either positive or negative relative to another room. It's always this, you always look at spaces. In general, animal housing spaces within a vivarium are typically negative relative to the hallway that allows you to control odors, except in a barrier situation. And this is the philosophical question. Some people believe that a rodent barrier room, because it's an SPF, specific pathogen-free environment, in order to maintain that health status, those rooms should be positive, negative to the hallway. So you need to think about those concepts as you design your facility. Again, some of this is philosophical. The way you control airflow within the space is through your HVAC system, your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. The most important aspect of facility design from a research perspective is attention to your HVAC. There is no more important system within a research environment than HVAC. In addition to controlling temperature, the HVAC also controls your humidity. And again, humidity has you're all in the South, you know humidity, how humidity affects your ambient temperature and your heat index. Same thing happens in an animal room. The ability to control humidity is also critical. So we look at ventilation or HVAC for a typical animal housing facility compared to a general office area, the space you're sitting in right now, a classroom. The HVAC within a research vivarium or even a veterinary hospital is 5 to 10 times more expensive due to the higher performance requirements. So not only is HVAC the most critical component of a vivarium, it is also the most expensive. And the reason that folks don't tend to understand why HVAC is so expensive in these research environments is that they compare the HVAC in their house to a research environment, which is a completely different thing. And this is why. We are required to maintain our temperature to be plus or minus 2 degrees from a set point. That's an extremely tight range of temperature requirement. So an example is you have a set point of, desired temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We are allowed to deviate 2 degrees below, 2 degrees above, so that the temperature range for that room is 68 to 72 degrees. And you're allowed to house certain species within that temperature range. If you get outside that range, you're outside the regulatory requirements for housing those animals, outside that thermal neutral zone we talked about. And so that HVAC must be designed to maintain that tight parameter. By comparison, in your home, you'd be lucky if your home environment could control temperature then plus or minus 5. That's a 10-degree swing. And that's just how most commercial systems function. The other HVAC parameter we look at is airflow. And airflow is measured by air exchanges per hour. And so the concept there is a higher the air exchange rate, you clean it or fresh air. It's just a washing of the air. If you get your air exchange rates down too low, you have a buildup of toxic gases. Again, ammonia levels are the most common thing that we find. But conversely, if your air exchange rate, as they become higher and higher, the air becomes drier, and the dry air leaves humidity. So there's a disease that you all have probably heard about in your lab animal course called ringtail. So ringtail is a disease that it affects rats and mice, more common in rats. And you typically only see ringtail in lower humidity environments. It's a disease that was thought to be a historical disease. Given the advances in modern HVAC, I would tell you about 15, 17 years ago, I encountered a case of ringtail, and the way it occurred is that we had rats housed in ventilated cages. Now, these ventilated cages are cages where the microenvironment receives a very high airflow rate. And it's a positively pressurized cage, thereby keeping the animals within the microenvironment very clean. The problem with those cages was that the air exchange rate was so high that the humidity level within the cage became extremely low. And so the newborn rats in those cages were experiencing ringtail. We moved those rats to a standard cage, non-ventilated cage, and the ringtail went away. This is something to keep in mind. Again, an example of how your facility design and your equipment can impact the overall health of those animals. Again, by comparison, if you look at the average air exchange for a surgery room, say 12 to 50 air exchange per hour, that's average. We go up as high as 18 to 20 air exchanges per hour in a surgery space. That's a nice, clean surgery area. Again, by comparison, commercial office space is 5 to 7 air exchanges per hour. You just need to think about the fan requirements to produce this type of air exchange rate are significant. We've already talked about this a little bit, quarantine facilities, what they're designed to do, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore, other than just to reemphasize that quarantine facilities and the ability to prevent or to contain or to prevent entry of disease is based upon the relative pressures, positive or relatively negative, and no matter what you're told, you must always trust but verify what the temperature is, what the relative air exchanges are, and the relative pressure of a given space. We talked about BSL-3, BSL-4 already. It's important to have standard operating procedures to verify how that facility is functioning, and so that everyone coming into the facility understands the procedure required to maintain the degree of containment that you're looking for. And these are just some references for those of you who might want to do some further reading on this. The National Institutes of Health has a document called Design Requirements Manual, DRM. One thing about the DRM, it is not a document that I would suggest someone look at who's building a private practice facility, other than to just get some ideas, because design standards in the DRM are keep that in mind if you're gonna look at that document. So let's talk a little bit about, just the basic concepts you would see. So in this diagram here, you see that everybody talked about a box within a box and relative spaces. So if you look at the middle box here, you see that's your animal housing area. This anteroom would be an area where you have an airlock to allow this space here to possibly be positive, negative to this space. And you want to control your visitor staff entry here. You're going to have this space here to separate these spaces, control entry here. This is the flow of equipment within your facility. So for your animal housing rooms, remember we talked earlier, we said in general, most things move from clean to dirty to maintain a nice stream of flow of traffic. The exception to that rule would be in a cage wash facility where you're gonna have cages coming from an animal room into a dirty environment, clean, and going into, to a dirty environment, and then transiting to a clean environment, then back to space. So this would be a departure from the clean to dirty traffic pattern that we talked about before. And then, of course, your loading dock as supplies are coming into the facility, animals are coming in from your vendors into your loading dock. You need to figure out, well, how is my loading dock going to be arranged so that I can get animals into the facility? If the loading dock is in the basement, your animal facility is on the 26th floor, as mine is, you have to figure out, well, how are my elevators going to be situated so I can get supplies and animals from the basement up to the 26th floor? And conversely, how am I going to move waste from my animal and cage wash area to those elevators down to the loading dock or to leave the building? The logistics of that are critical to consider when you're building out your animal facility. Just here are some other things you can think about, not only how equipment is maintained, but also how equipment is moved into a facility. If you want to move an MRI into an existing facility, you need to think about the weight of those magnets. We had a situation where we're moving a large piece of equipment, and the only way to do it was to take the side of the wall off the building, shut down the street, bring a crane up to the 18th floor, and boom the equipment into the facility. Those are things you have to think about when you're trying to move equipment into a space. So I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to go speed up here. Just want to reemphasize, so why should you as a veterinarian be interested or involved in this whole concept of facility design? Well, again, from a laboratory animal perspective, you are the animal expert. And regardless to what someone is telling you about the way a facility is designed and should function, you are the last word on what should be done to maintain the safety and well-being of those animals. So if someone is telling you, for instance, you have highly ventilated cages, the air exchange rate in those cages is around 15 to 25 air exchanges per hour, then maybe we can design an animal room, the macro environment, to be at 6 to 7 air changes per hour as a cost-saving measure. On the surface, that sounds like a reasonable compromise, cost-saving, more energy efficient. But you as a veterinarian would say, well, what happens if I lose power or something happens to my ventilated cage? Now my animals are in a room that has an air exchange rate of 5 to 7 air changes per hour, which is unacceptable. If you're going to consider that as a design feature, you must have the ability to ramp up those fans in your macro environment as a secondary measure to protect you against failure. Those are things that you as a veterinarian would bring to the table, because I can guarantee you the typical engineer or design person may not consider that as full. So you are the advocate. You are the strongest advocate for the proper design, given your expertise and your responsibilities, as well as you understand the regulatory standards and requirements. And finally, flexibility. A facility is designed today to house mice or better yet, to house pigs and dogs. 10 years from now, maybe housing mice. And you need to build in enough flexibility in that facility so that it's not going to cost your institution much to convert it, as well as it's going to be functional as you change from species to species. So, some of you have probably never looked at floor plans. We say blueprints here. Blueprints, floor plans, the same kind of thing. We're going to go through a quick rundown of a facility that I worked on recently. I'll just tell you that it takes practice. The very first time I looked at a floor plan, I was flabbergasted. What is this thing? So let's go through this really quick. So this is what we call a stacking plan. This is just a building. You see here's the basement level. This is the top level. This level here, this is the vivarium floor. So these animals are maintained on the 26th floor of a 27-story building. Supplies come in on the first floor, and they have to be moved up here to the 26th floor. So that has to be factored into your operation. And a stacking plan is how you get that first overview when you kind of conceptualize the facility. And then you go to the 26th floor itself. So let me walk you through this space. And there's some general designations for design. So you come into the facility here, when you see a square box like that with doors, that's always an elevator. Okay? This is a designation for a door. These are animal housing rooms. You note the door is always open inward in an animal housing space. So from a traffic perspective, you come into this facility, it's a door here, a sliding glass door. You come here in animal housing. This is a cage wash facility. You can tell it's cage wash because it seems like two rooms here separated by a little small space. This is your cage wash equipment. This is the dirty side, clean side. Supplies come in here, flow out here into the animal housing space. This is designated as elevator space. Same here. These are boxes with doors. These are your freight elevators. They're typically in the back of the building. You would never put freight elevators in the front of a building. So all of your dirty materials are going up and down these elevators. In this particular facility, on this side of the building, and it has nothing to do with necessarily design, but this side of the building houses rodents. This side houses primates. Sheep are housed over here. But the primary thing that I want you to note is these standard designations for what is a door, this is a corridor here. This is how the spaces are laid out. So if you start to kind of walk through the facility mentally, the floor plan starts to make a little sense. This is a little more confusing picture. So this particular job required to replace the HVAC. So this is all the plumbing and ductwork associated with these fans. Fans are designated, typically this S means supply. We had two supply fans, S5 and 6, that support a given area. When you're designating fans, they'll typically call them out like this. They'll highlight them and just designate them with a number. So supply here, exhaust here. So this S1 fan is supported by this E fan. So each supply and exhaust are they work in tandem to maintain the space. Looking a little bit further, one of the important criteria is to look at access. So when you have a feature like this means handicap accessible. So there's ADA requirement, Americans with Disability Act requirements. So these spaces must be laid out such that someone with a disability can access the facility. So again, there's a door here walking into this facility. This is a suite design. What we did here, this facility is going to be renovated. So these dotted lines indicate walls that will be taken out to result in this facility. So dotted lines typically in a floor design means something that's going to be demolished. Probably a demolition plan. Same thing here. the difference in this particular, figure is that it shows replacement equipment. This is a decropsy space. You have a downdraft table here. You have a cooler here, doors opening in. Again, the circle showing the ability for someone with handicap access to